Welcome to my channel. Subscribe and enjoy daily stories about cheating, revenge, and relationship advice. I still remember the first time I met Mike. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the air is cool but the sun warms your skin just enough. I was sitting at a small cafe near my apartment, nursing a cup of coffee and absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine, when a shadow fell across my table. "Is this seat taken?" I looked up, startled, and there he was, Mike, with his easy smile and kind eyes. His hair was tousled from the wind, and there was an unassuming confidence about him that instantly put me at ease. We ended up talking for hours that day, long after my coffee had gone cold. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, like every word I said mattered. That was 8 years ago. We had been inseparable ever since. In so many ways, Mike had been the perfect partner, steady, kind, reliable. The kind of man who would stop whatever he was doing just to listen to me vent about work, or who would bring me tea when I stayed up late reading. He knew how to make me feel safe, loved. I didn't take that for granted. But as time went on, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, it crept in slowly, like a cold draft you don't notice until you're already shivering. The warmth between us was still there, but there was a growing distance too, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Our sex life, once full of excitement and spontaneity, had become routine. I tried not to dwell on it, but the more I pushed those thoughts away, the stronger they became. I loved Mike, God, I loved him so much, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. One night, after a particularly long day, we were lying in bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting a warm light over the room. Mike was reading a book, and I was scrolling through my phone, feeling restless. "Mike, can we talk?" I said, my voice tentative. He glanced over at me, lowering his book. "Of course. What's up?" I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "I've been thinking about us. About, our intimacy." He set the book down on his nightstand, giving me his full attention. "Okay. Is something bothering you?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's just. I don't know how to explain it. I love you, and I love being with you, but sometimes it feels like we're stuck in a routine. Like we're just going through the motions." Mike's brow furrowed, and he shifted closer to me. "What do you mean? Are you unhappy?" "I wouldn't say that," I replied quickly, not wanting to hurt him. "I'm happy with you. I've been having these thoughts, these fantasies, and I don't know how to talk to you about them. It's like there's this part of me that wants something more, something different." He was quiet for a moment, clearly processing what I was saying. I hated seeing the look of confusion on his face. Mike had always been the type to want to fix things, to make everything better, but I wasn't sure this was something he could fix. "What kind of fantasies?" he asked cautiously. "You can talk to me, Sarah. You know that, right?" I nodded, but my chest tightened with the weight of what I was about to say. "I don't know, just different things. Things I've never tried, or that I've read about. It's not that I don't enjoy being with you, it's just that I feel like there's more out there that I haven't experienced." Mike's face softened, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. "I get that. We've been together for a long time. It's natural to want to try new things." He paused, searching for the right words. I thought we were enough for each other. That I was enough." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "You are, Mike. You are enough. This isn't about you. It's about me, and these feelings I don't know how to deal with. I don't want to hurt you. I'm just trying to figure out how to make everything better." He squeezed my hand gently, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "I want you to be happy, Sarah. If this is something you need to explore, then we can talk about it. Maybe we can try new things together." I gave him a small, grateful smile. "I'd like that. I just don't want to lose what we have." "You won't," he said firmly, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. "We'll figure it out, together." That was Mike, always willing to work things out, always putting my needs before his own. And yet, even as we agreed to try new things, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a part of me he would never truly understand. It wasn't his fault, it wasn't even mine. But the fantasies I had, the desires I couldn't name, lingered in the back of my mind like a secret I didn't want to share. Over the next few weeks, we did try. We talked more openly, experimented with new ideas in the bedroom, things I'd read about, things Mike was willing to try for my sake. And while it helped, while there were moments when I felt that spark again, it wasn't enough. The fantasies had grown larger than I could control, and no matter what we did, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing. Something I couldn't find with Mike, no matter how hard we tried. And I hated myself for it. I hated that I couldn't just be satisfied with what I had, with the love of a man who would do anything for me. But deep down, I knew that these feelings weren't going away. They were only getting stronger. Mike noticed, of course. He always noticed when something was off with me. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, he turned to me, concern etched on his face. "You're not yourself lately," he said softly. "I can feel it." "What's really going on?" I stared at the screen, avoiding his gaze. "I'm just thinking a lot. About us. About everything." He didn't push, but I could feel the weight of his eyes on me. "Sarah, if there's something you need to say, just say it." I finally met his gaze, and the words tumbled out before I could stop them. "I'm afraid, Mike. Afraid that I'm not enough. That we're not enough. And I don't know what to do about it." His expression tightened, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he reached out, pulling me into his arms, holding me close as though he could somehow protect me from the storm brewing inside me. "We'll get through this," he whispered, his breath warm against my hair. "I promise." But as I lay there in his arms, feeling his steady heartbeat against mine, I wasn't so sure. Something was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. The office Christmas party had always been one of those events I looked forward to, even if Mike wasn't thrilled about it. He hated small talk with my colleagues and the stuffy formality that usually accompanied office gatherings, but this year, he had promised to come along. At least, until work had thrown a last-minute project his way, and he couldn't make it. I tried to hide my disappointment when he told me, but he knew me too well. "I'll make it up to you," he said, leaning in to kiss my forehead before I left for the party. "Maybe we'll have our own private party when you get back." I smiled at him, brushing a hand through his hair. "I'll hold you to that." The party was being held at one of the more upscale hotels downtown, and as soon as I stepped into the grand ballroom, I was surrounded by glittering decorations, soft holiday music, and the sounds of laughter. My colleagues were already deep into the holiday spirit, drinks in hand and wide smiles on their faces. I felt a surge of excitement, a kind of energy I hadn't felt in a while. I spotted David almost immediately. He was standing by the bar, casually sipping a drink and chatting with a group of coworkers. I didn't know him well, he'd only started at the firm a few months ago, but there was something about him that had caught my attention from the start. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, with that effortless confidence, or the way his eyes seemed to light up when he laughed. Tonight, he looked especially handsome in a charcoal gray suit, his dark hair slightly disheveled in a way that seemed intentional. I wasn't looking for trouble, but there was something about the way he smiled at me when our eyes met from across the room that made my pulse quicken. I told myself it was harmless, just a little holiday flirtation, something to lift my spirits since Mike couldn't be here. But even as I thought that, a part of me knew I was walking a dangerous line. As the evening wore on, I found myself gravitating toward David. The champagne had loosened me up, and the conversation flowed easily. He was funny, quick-witted, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most interesting person in the room. We talked about everything, work, travel, music, but beneath the surface of our casual conversation, there was something else, something electric. "You know, I never thought office parties could be fun," David said, leaning in slightly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "But this one's starting to change my mind." I laughed, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. "Well, you've obviously never been to the right parties, then." His gaze lingered on mine for just a second longer than it should have. "Maybe you're right." The words hung in the air between us, charged with an unspoken tension. I knew I should walk away, that I shouldn't let this go any further, but I didn't want to. There was something about David's attention that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was the thrill of being seen, of being wanted by someone new. After a few more drinks, the music picked up, and people began to move toward the dance floor. David and I had been standing close to the edge of the room, our conversation growing more intimate by the minute. Then, as the familiar tune of a holiday classic began to play, David held out his hand. "Dance with me." I hesitated, glancing around the room to see if anyone was watching, but the party had taken on a life of its own. No one was paying attention to us. "Just one dance," he added, a playful smile on his lips. "It'll be fun." I bit my lip, considering. What harm could it do? It was just a dance. "Okay," I said finally, slipping my hand into his. We moved on to the dance floor, and as we swayed to the music, I couldn't help but notice how good it felt to be in his arms. His hand rested on the small of my back, his touch gentle but firm, and every time he leaned in to speak to me, his breath brushed against my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. "You look amazing tonight, Sarah," he murmured as we danced. "I've been wanting to tell you that all night." "Thank you," I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, a mixture of excitement and guilt swirling in my stomach. "You don't look so bad yourself," he chuckled, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm glad you think so." We danced for what felt like forever, the room spinning around us as we moved in sync. I could feel the attraction between us growing with every step, every glance. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and I knew I was playing with fire, but in that moment, I didn't care. As the song came to an end, David didn't let go immediately. Instead, he pulled me just a little closer, his hand lingering on my waist. "I've really enjoyed talking to you tonight, Sarah." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "Me too." There was a beat of silence, the kind where both of you know something's about to happen but neither wants to be the one to make the first move. Then, just as the next song started, David leaned in, his lips dangerously close to mine. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," I whispered, even though my body betrayed me, leaning into him just the slightest bit. "I know," he replied, his voice low and rough. "But sometimes the best things aren't." Before I could respond, the sound of a colleague's laughter nearby broke the moment. We both pulled back, suddenly aware of where we were and who could be watching. I felt a rush of embarrassment, followed closely by guilt. What was I doing? This wasn't me. I wasn't the kind of person who crossed lines like this. I had Mike at home, waiting for me, trusting me. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward David. There was something between us, something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in so long. "David, I started," but he shook his head. "I know," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. "No, it's not that. I need to go." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Okay. But Sarah, if you ever want to talk, or if you need anything, you know where to find me." I gave him a tight smile, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. "Thanks, David." As I turned to leave the party, my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the temptation pulling at me, beckoning me to explore what I knew I shouldn't. The spark I had felt with David was undeniable, but so was the guilt. I loved Mike, didn't I? How could I even consider jeopardizing what we had for something so fleeting? But as I stepped out into the cold night air, the memory of David's touch lingered, and I couldn't help but wonder what might happen if I let myself give in to the temptation. The days after the Christmas party were a blur of conflicting emotions. I kept replaying the moment with David on the dance floor, the way he had looked at me, how his touch had made me feel. Part of me wanted to forget it, to chalk it up to a harmless flirtation, a mistake that didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The pull I felt toward him wasn't something I could easily ignore. Mike noticed I was distracted, but I brushed it off. We had our private party, just like he promised, but even as we shared an intimate evening, my mind kept drifting back to David. I felt guilty, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about him. A few days later, an email from David appeared in my inbox. It was short, casual, just a follow-up to something work-related, but the sight of his name on my screen sent a jolt through me. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing. I knew I shouldn't respond. I knew that if I let this go any further, I'd be crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But I replied. It started with innocent messages. A little banter, a few jokes, nothing inappropriate. But slowly, over the course of the next few weeks, our conversations became more personal. We talked about our lives, our dreams, our frustrations. David was easy to talk to, and there was something about the way he listened that made me feel understood in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And then, one day, he asked me to meet him for lunch. I hesitated before replying. I told myself it was just lunch, just a friendly meal between colleagues. But the truth was, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something between us, something that had been growing since the night of the party, and meeting him outside of work felt like the first step towards something I wasn't sure I could come back from. Still, I agreed. We met at a small restaurant tucked away from the main streets, the kind of place where you wouldn't accidentally run into anyone you knew. As soon as I saw him, my heart skipped a beat. He looked as handsome as ever, his smile warm and inviting as he stood to greet me. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft as he took my hand. "I'm glad you came." I smiled nervously, my mind racing with all the reasons I shouldn't be there. "It's just lunch, right?" "Of course," he replied, though the look in his eyes said otherwise. We talked through most of the meal, keeping the conversation light, but there was an undercurrent of tension between us. Every time our hands brushed or our eyes met across the table, I felt it, a spark of something dangerous, something I knew I should walk away from but didn't want to. Toward the end of lunch, the conversation shifted, becoming more personal again. David leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the party." I felt my heart hammer in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I had been thinking about him too, more than I wanted to admit, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I've been thinking about you too," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But this isn't, we shouldn't be doing this." David reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm, and it sent a shiver through me. "I know it's complicated, but I can't help how I feel. I want you, Sarah." I pulled my hand away, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. I couldn't deny the attraction I felt for him, but this wasn't just about me. There was Mike to think about, our life together, the years we had spent building something real. "I'm married, David," I said, my voice firm, though my resolve was crumbling. "I love Mike." "I know," he said softly, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not asking you to leave him. I'm just asking for, whatever this is between us. We don't have to label it. We don't have to change anything in our lives. But I can't pretend like I don't want more." My mind was spinning. I should have gotten up, walked out, ended it right there. But instead, I found myself leaning in, drawn to him, the temptation of what could be pulling me under. "We can't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. David's eyes searched mine, his gaze intense. "Tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me you can just walk away from this." I couldn't. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts were consumed by David, by the way his hand had felt on mine, by the look in his eyes when he said he wanted me. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the desire. I loved Mike, but I couldn't deny that I had been craving something more, something different. The next day, David texted me. It was simple, just asking if I wanted to meet again, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I stared at the message, torn between what I knew was right and what I wanted. I typed out my response quickly, my fingers shaking as I hit send. We met again the following week. This time, it wasn't for lunch. David had rented a small hotel room, tucked away in a part of town where no one would recognize us. The moment I walked in, I knew what was going to happen. He was standing by the window, his expression soft but intense, and when he turned to look at me, I felt the last of my resistance melt away. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low as he closed the distance between us. I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "I'm sure." He reached for me, his hands gentle as they cupped my face, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, the pent-up desire between us finally spilling over. I had never felt anything like it before, this rush of passion, this sense of losing myself completely in the moment. "Sarah," he murmured against my lips, his hands sliding down my back. "I've wanted this for so long." I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled him closer, letting the weight of the moment, the consequences, fade into the background. Afterward, as we lay tangled in the sheets, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. I had crossed a line that I could never uncross. There was no going back now. "I don't know what happens next," I said quietly, staring up at the ceiling. David propped himself up on one elbow, his hand tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. Let's just take it one day at a time." I turned to look at him, my heart heavy with guilt and something else I couldn't quite name. "What if we're making a huge mistake?" He smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Maybe we are. But sometimes, mistakes are worth making." I didn't have an answer to that. All I knew was that I was in too deep now, and there was no turning back. The affair had begun, and no matter how much I wanted to stop it, I couldn't. Not yet. The days after that night with David were a whirlwind of emotions. At work, we were careful, no stolen glances, no whispers in the hallway. It was as if nothing had happened between us. But under the surface, I was drowning in guilt. The moments we shared in that hotel room were unforgettable, electric, and yet, each time I thought about Mike, a sharp pain stabbed at my chest. I was living two lives, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. Mike had noticed the change. He was always perceptive, especially when it came to me. One evening, after dinner, we were sitting in the living room, the TV on but neither of us really watching. I could feel him looking at me, his gaze searching my face. "Sarah," he began, his voice cautious, "is everything okay?" I froze. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. I forced a smile, hoping to bury the rising panic. "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" I replied, but even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. Mike didn't buy it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at me with that deep concern I had always loved about him. "You've been distant," he said softly. "You're not yourself. I know work's been stressful, but it feels like there's more going on. Is something bothering you?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. This was the moment I should have confessed. I should have told him everything, the affair, the guilt, the confusion. But the words lodged in my throat. I couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes, to watch our life together crumble in an instant. "I'm fine, Mike," I lied. "Really? Just a lot on my mind." He studied me for a long moment, clearly unconvinced. "Sarah, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? We've always been honest with each other." The irony of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I nodded, forcing another smile. "I know. I'll be okay." Mike sighed, clearly frustrated but unwilling to push me any further. He leaned back into the couch, his attention drifting back to the TV, though I could see the worry still etched on his face. That night, I lay awake long after Mike had fallen asleep. My mind was racing, torn between the life I had with him and the secret I was keeping. David had become a constant presence in my thoughts, an escape from the routine and predictability of my marriage. But at what cost? Every time I looked at Mike, the guilt gnawed at me. How long could I keep this up before everything fell apart? A text from David broke my spiraling thoughts. David, I can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again? I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to reply, to give in to the temptation again. But the other part, the part that still loved Mike, was screaming at me to stop before it was too late. I didn't respond. The next morning, I tried to focus on work, burying myself in emails and meetings. But when I saw David in the office, my resolve began to slip. He caught my eye as he passed by my desk, a subtle nod, and I knew he was waiting for me to make the next move. At lunchtime, he texted again. David, can we talk? Please. My stomach churned. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever, but I also knew that seeing him would only make things more complicated. Still, I agreed to meet him in a quiet corner of the office cafeteria. When I arrived, David was already there, his expression tense. He stood as soon as he saw me, concern etched on his face. Sarah, he said, his voice low. I haven't heard from you since that night. What's going on? I took a deep breath, my heart racing. I don't know if I can keep doing this, David. It's too much. The guilt. Mike, he cut me off, stepping closer, his eyes searching mine. I get it. I know it's complicated, but you can't deny what's between us. I can't just pretend this doesn't mean anything. I looked away, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. It's not that simple. I love Mike. I didn't mean for this to happen. David reached for my hand, his touch gentle but insistent. But it did happen, Sarah. You can't take that back. I'm not asking you to leave him, I never have. But I don't want to lose what we've found, either. I pulled my hand away, my mind a jumble of emotions. What do you want from me, David? To just keep sneaking around, lying to Mike, pretending this is all fine? I can't live like that, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. I don't want to lose you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the situation hung heavy between us. I could feel the cracks beginning to form, the delicate balance of my life starting to crumble. I need time, I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. I need to figure out what I want. David nodded, though I could see the hurt in his eyes. I understand. Just, don't shut me out completely. Please. A few days passed, and the tension at home was growing. Mike was trying his best to be supportive, to give me space, but I could see how much my distance was hurting him. Every night, we sat across from each other at dinner, our conversation strained, the silence between us louder than ever. One evening, after another quiet meal, Mike put down his fork and looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart drop. Sarah, he said, his voice tight with emotion, I can't do this anymore. My stomach flipped. Do what? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his eyes filled with pain. This. The distance. The silence. I don't know what's going on, but I feel like I'm losing you. And I can't stand it. I felt my throat tighten, panic rising in my chest. You're not losing me, Mike. I'm going through something, and I don't know how to explain it. Mike's eyes searched mine, pleading. Then talk to me, Sarah. Tell me what's going on. I feel like you're slipping away, and I don't know how to fix it. Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know how to fix it either, I whispered. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, Mike spoke again, his voice trembling. Is there someone else? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked up, my heart pounding, panic flooding through me. "Mike, just tell me the truth," he said, his voice breaking. "Please. I can't keep living in this uncertainty." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him that there was no one else, that everything would be okay. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, the silence between us stretched on, and I could see the answer in my eyes reflected in his. Mike stood up, pushing his chair back roughly. "I knew it," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "God, Sarah." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there, the weight of my betrayal crashing down on me. That night, Mike slept on the couch. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like my world was falling apart. Everything I had been trying to avoid had finally come to a head, and now, I was standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of how to move forward. The affair had started with temptation, a spark of excitement, but now it was unraveling everything I had built with Mike. I had made my choice, and now I was facing the fallout.